Welcome to Older Militarist Radio TV, and we're lifelong Catholics. And what we do is all for free, and for our love of Jesus Christ, and for our Holy Mother, the Church. And we'll defend our Holy Mother, the Church. Today we are going to be talking about the occupation of Japan with Douglas MacArthur, and we are with Brother Alexis Bonello.
Thank you, AJ, for having me on Order Militaris Radio TV for this wonderful biographic series on this great American general. And I want to start by thanking the MacArthur National Library in Norfolk, Virginia, for giving you permission to read from his reminiscences. And this is a book I highly recommend you get to have on your bookshelf. Everyone should know about the great leaders of American history. Reminiscences, Douglas with MacArthur, and you can get a copy from the Navy Bookstore. AJ will put a link in the show page. And we are only reading like not even a tenth of a percent of what's in this great book. He's a great writer, very high-minded, very intelligent, very perspicacious. If you don't know that word, look it up. And it's a delight to read, and AJ has been plowing through it as we get through. So we've come to the point where Japan has been bombed twice by nuclear weapons, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the Japanese decide to surrender. And this is going to begin one of the, it seems like MacArthur always has greater and greater responsibilities. It's going to be the point of MacArthur's life where he was one of the most powerful men in the world, because he became the ruler of Japan and Korea, he himself personally. So AJ, what is we're going to begin with what? The surrender of Japan on a battleship?
Well, they're going to start setting up all the ceremonies. And MacArthur starts off, I did not participate in the original negotiations for the surrender, but after the Japanese government had agreed to terms, the task of implementation fell to me. Over the radio, I directed the imperial government to send a delegation to Manila to receive instructions concerning the surrender ceremonies. This delegation was charged with the removal of propellers from all Japanese aircraft on Yokohama's Atsugi airfield, while providing transportation for the Allies from Atsugi to Yokohama, and to reserve the new Grand Hotel for Allied use. Yokohama would be my temporary headquarters. The battleship Missouri, the scene of the formal surrender ceremonies. The Japanese argued about only one thing. They made an earnest protest against the use of Atsugi airfield for my arrival, feeling that it involved too great a risk. Atsugi was a training base for kamikaze pilots. A number of them were living in its vicinity. Many of these suicide pilots refused to surrender. They mutinied and invaded the palace grounds in protest of the emperor's broadcast announcing the Japanese capitulation. They killed the commanding general of the Imperial Guard Division and fired on the house of the Prime Minister, Kentaro Suzuki, before being subdued. The Japanese delegation were fearful of my landing in such an atmosphere of violence.
A very prudent man. He asked the propellers taken off the planes. He was afraid maybe someone would decide to do a kamikaze attack on the peace delegation. And the Missouri battleship, if you don't know, was at Pearl Harbor on the Day of Infamy. It had survived and was repaired, and the American government made sure that that would be the craft on which the surrender of Japan would be signed as a way of saying, you started it and we ended it.
So his staff was utterly opposed to my projected landing. They called it a gamble. They argued that on Kanto plain of Tokyo alone, 22 Japanese divisions, 300,000 well-trained fighting soldiers remained, while a number of well-armed troops were stationed across the enemy's homeland. For the supreme commander, a handful of his staff and a small advance party to land unarmed, unescorted, where they would be outnumbered by thousands to one, was foolhardy. But years of overseas duty schooled me well in the lessons of the Orient, and what was probably more important, had taught the Far East that I was its friend. Small advance parties were flown into Atsuki, and on the morning of August 30th, General Eichelberger arrived to direct the landing operations. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, my C-54 baton, emblazoned on its nose, soared above Kamakuro's giant bronze Buddha, past beautiful Mount Fuji, and swung down toward Atsugi. General Whitney, who was acting as my military secretary, recorded his feelings of the moment. We circled the field at a little more than treetop height, and I looked out on the field at a flat stretch of Kanto Plain. I could see numerous anti-aircraft emplacements. It was difficult not to let my mind dwell on Japan's recent performances. The war had been started without a formal declaration. Nearly everywhere Japanese soldiers had refused to give up until killed. The usual laws of war had not been complied with. Deadly traps had frequently been set. Here was the greatest opportunity for a final and climactic act. The anti-aircraft guns could not possibly miss at this range. Had death, the insensible monster of the battle, passed MacArthur by on 1,000 fields, only to murder him at the end. I held my breath. I think the whole world was holding its breath. But as usual, he had been right. He knew the Orient. He knew the basic Japanese character too well to have thus gambled blindly with death. He knew and trusted that national spirit of traditional chivalry called Bushido. The plane nestled down on the field, and MacArthur, his corncob pipe in his mouth, got out. He paused for a second or two to look around him. The sky was a bright blue splotch with patches of fleecy clouds. The sun beating down on the airfield made the concrete runways an apron shimmer with the heat. There were several other United States planes in the field, and a few armed Allied troops in the area seemed a frighteningly small force. A handful of officers waited to greet him. The senior was General Eichelberger, who strode forward to meet MacArthur. They shook hands, and MacArthur said in a quiet voice, "Bob, from Melbourne to Tokyo is a long way, but this seems to be the end of the road."
Just 2 days before this, Truman gave MacArthur command to govern Japan in the occupation. And from this air base, he goes to the Missouri and Yokohama Harbor.
So then they get into the transportation that the Japanese can round up for the trip into Yokohama. MacArthur climbed into an American Lincoln of uncertain vintage. The other officers found their places in a ramshackled motorcade. A fire engine that resembled a Tunerville trolley started with a backfire explosion. And then the guys who were in that was like, "Oh no, they got us." All along the roadway, 15 miles to Yokohama, they stood. They saw the procession of the Japanese soldiers. They stood in a long line each side, their backs to MacArthur in a gesture of respect. As they guarded their emperor. There were 2 divisions of them, 30,000 men fully armed. I must say that I regarded these formidable-looking troops with a wary eye. My misgivings were not put at rest by this display, because I could not help wondering whether the Japanese intended it as a gesture of deference, whether they felt that a strong guard like this was really necessary, or whether there was some other deep-seated mysterious ulterior motive. Yokohama seemed a phantom city. Shop windows were boarded up, blinds were drawn, and many of the sidewalks were deserted. Down empty streets, we were taken to the new Grand Hotel, where we would stay until MacArthur made his formal entry into Tokyo. The new Grand Hotel is a magnificent establishment erected after its predecessor was destroyed by the earthquake of 1923, and World War II had been kinder to the second building than the earthquake had been to the first. The manager and his staff all but prostrated themselves as they greeted us and showed us to the suite selected for MacArthur. We were tired and hungry, so we lost no time going to the dining room, where amid the other American officers, almost surrounded by solicitous hotel officials, we were seated and served a steak dinner. I found it difficult to resist the impulse to snatch MacArthur's plate away from him that first night, make sure that his food hadn't been poisoned. When I voiced my misgivings to him, he merely laughed and said, "No one can live forever."
Yeah, so the Japanese chivalry code, Bushido, does not permit treachery after after a promise is made. And this is what his knowledge of Japanese culture enabled him to be the ruler of Japan so well. Remember, his father had been ambassador to Japan, and he had spent his youth in Japan at his father's side, and even, I think, part of his military career as an attaché at his father's side. So he knew the Japanese well, more than anyone else in the United States. And Japan is a very unusual country. If you don't know geography, Yokohama was like the port open to the west, and it's just down the coast from Tokyo on the west side of the Tokyo harbor. And Japan's a very unusual place. To this day, if you walk in public, you won't hear anyone talk out loud. The Japanese only talk in private. They never talk out loud. If you see anyone talking out loud in any park or any sidewalk today in Japan, you know they're a foreigner, because the Japanese don't talk out. It's like a monastic country. The whole country is unbelievable. But it was considered they regard privacy so highly. So it's a very unusual country, and they like using cash, not electronic stuff. So they're very nice people. This was August 30th. The surrender takes place in what, September 2nd or 8th?
September 2nd.
Okay.
So prisoners have begun dribbling out of the Japanese camps almost as soon as the landings in Japan were made. Among the first of those liberated were General Wainwright, General A.E. Percival. They had been held in Mukden in Manchuria and had been flown back to Manila. They immediately directed that they be brought to Japan for the surrender ceremonies on the Missouri. I was just sitting down to dinner when my aide brought me the word that they had arrived. I rose and started for the lobby, but before I could reach it, the door swung open, and there was Wainwright. He was haggard and aged. His uniform hung in folds on his fleshless form. He walked with difficulty and with help of a cane. His eyes were sunken, and there were pits in his cheeks. His hair was snow white, and his skin looked like old shoe leather. He made a brave effort to smile as I took him in my arms, but when he tried to talk, his voice wouldn't come. For 3 years he had imagined himself in disgrace for having surrendered Corregidor. He believed he would never again be given an active command. This shocked me. "Why, Jim," I said, "your corps is yours when you want it." The emotion that registered on that gaunt face still haunts me.
Great leader, MacArthur.
The formal ceremonies of surrender aboard the Missouri were fixed for September 2nd, 1945. I had received no instructions as to what to say or what to do. I was on my own, standing on the quarterdeck with only God and my own conscience to guide me.
Yes. Does he also include in the Reminiscences the text of the surrender?
Yeah.
Okay, so if he gives a speech first, we'll listen to the speech, but if they sign the surrender first, or if you can read the surrender document, yeah. These important historic documents that every American should at least hear once in their life.
We are gathered here, representatives of the major warring powers, to conclude a solemn agreement whereby peace may be restored. The issues involving divergent ideals and ideologies have been determined on the battlefields of the world, and hence are not for our discussion or debate. Nor is it for us here to meet representing us as we do a majority of the people of the earth, in a spirit of distrust, malice, or hatred, but rather it is for us, both victors and vanquished, to rise to that higher dignity which alone befits the sacred purpose we are about to serve, committing all our people unreservedly to faithful compliance with the obligation that they are here formally to assume. It is my earnest hope, and indeed the hope of all mankind, that from this solemn occasion a better world shall emerge out of the blood and carnage of the past. A world founded upon faith and understanding, a world dedicated to the dignity of man and the fulfillment of his most cherished wish for freedom, tolerance, and justice. The terms and conditions upon which the surrender of the Japanese imperial forces is here to be given and accepted are contained in the instruments surrendered now before you. As Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, I announce it my firm purpose in the tradition of the countries that I represent to proceed in the discharge of my responsibilities with justice and tolerance, while taking all necessary depositions to ensure that the terms of surrender are fully and promptly faithfully complied with. And so he asked all the different countries to come up and sign where they're supposed to sign. And they pointed out on the documents where the Japanese were supposed to sign. And
It wasn't just a treaty between the United States and Japan. Britain signed it, France signed it, Australia signed it. I don't know if the representatives of the Chinese signed it.
yep. China,
All the
United,
other Europe, China signed it.
United States, China, United Kingdom, the Soviet Union, Australia, Canada, France, the Netherlands, and New Zealand all signed it.
All signed it. And I think they appointed their own generals to do the signing. So, does it say who signed on behalf of Japan? The Prime Minister? Or a general?
Okay, oh boy, here we go. I'm going to butcher this. Shumimitsu signed first, followed by Umidizu.
Okay.
So the Japanese signed first, then 8 minutes later, MacArthur put his signature down, then all the other representatives followed. Then he goes on, let us pray that peace be now restored to the world, and God willing, preserve it always. These proceedings are closed. Now here comes the speech. Today the guns are silent. A great tragedy has ended. A great victory has been won. The skies no longer rain death. The seas bear only commerce. Men everywhere walk upright in the sunlight. The entire world is quietly at peace. The holy mission has been completed. In reporting this to you, the people, I speak for the thousands of silent lips, forever stilled among the jungles and the beaches and the deep waters of the Pacific, which mark the way. I speak for the unnamed brave millions homeward bound to take up the challenge of that future, which they did so much to salvage from the brink of disaster. As I took back on the long tortuous trail from those grim days of Bataan and Corregidor, when an entire world lived in fear, when democracy was on the defensive everywhere, when the modern civilization trembled in the balance. I thank a merciful God that He has given us the faith, the courage, and the power from which to mold victory. We have known the bitterness of defeat and exultation of triumph. From both we have learned that there can be no turning back. We must go forward to preserve in peace what we won in war. A new era is upon us. Even the lesson of victory itself brings with it profound concern, both for our future security and the survival of civilization. The destructiveness of the war potential, through progressive advances in scientific discovery, has in fact now reached a point which revises the traditional concept of war. Men since the beginning of time have sought peace. Various methods through the ages have attempted to devise international process to prevent or settle disputes between nations. From the very start, workable methods were found insofar as individual citizens were concerned. But the mechanics of instrumentally a larger international scope have never been successful. Military alliances, balances of power, leagues of nations, all in turn failed, leaving the only path to be by the crucible of war. We have had our last chance. If we do not now devise some greater, more equitable system, Armageddon will be at our door. The problem basically is theological and involves the spiritual recrudescence and improvement of human character that will synchronize with our almost matchless advances in science, art, literature, and all material and cultural development of the past 2,000 years. We must be of the Spirit if we are to save the flesh. We stand in Tokyo today, reminiscent of our countryman, Commodore Perry, 92 years ago. His purpose was to bring Japan an era of enlightenment and progress by lifting the veil of isolation to the friendship, trade, and commerce of the world. But alas, the knowledge thereby gained of Western science was forged into an instrument of oppression and human enslavement. Freedom of expression, freedom of action, even freedom of thought were denied through appeal to superstition and through the application of force. We are committed by the Potsdam Declaration of Principles to see that the Japanese people are liberated from this condition of slavery. It is my purpose to implement this commitment just as rapidly as the armed forces are demobilized and other essential steps taken to neutralize the war potential. The energy of the Japanese race, if properly directed, will enable expansion vertically rather than horizontally. If the talents of the race are turned into the constructive channels, the country can lift itself from its present deplorable state into a position of dignity. To the Pacific Basin has come the vista of a new emancipated world. Today, freedom is on the offensive. Democracy is on the march. Today in Asia as well as in Europe, unshackled people are tasting the full sweetness of liberty, the relief from fear. In the Philippines, America has evolved a model for this new free world of Asia. In the Philippines, America has demonstrated that peoples of the East and peoples of the West may walk side by side in mutual respect and with mutual benefit. The history of our sovereignty there has now the full confidence of the East. And so, my fellow countrymen, today I report to you that your sons and daughters have served you well and faithfully the calm, deliberate, determined fighting spirit of the American soldier and sailor, based upon tradition of historical truth, as against the fanaticism of an enemy supported only by mythological fiction. Their spiritual strength and power has brought us through to victory. When they are homebound, take care of them.
Did he give that speech there in the Missouri, or did he give it by radio after the fact?
Both.
Okay. Mm-hmm. He wasn't pussyfooting around on diplomatic terms to that speech. He let the Japanese have it. You know, they're there and they heard it too. So he goes on now to govern Japan for the next 3 years, and he becomes Supreme Commander in 51 of all allied forces in the Pacific. He did some unusual things as ruler of Japan, but why don't we take a break and remind everyone that, you know, if you like the programs of Order Militaris Radio TV, share them. And there are lots of programs out there, and many of you have children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, or you know homeschooling programs, you're on social media. The historic programs we do from a Catholic point of view are unique on the internet. Almost no other organization does them. And we read from real sources, so we're encouraging the use of books. And that's the whole purpose of all the programs AJ has, to get you to buy books and read books, because that's where much more information is had than here. But you know, AJ could do so much more if he had a studio. And he is just working at a tiny little desk. It's not much bigger than that, on a small computer. And we started a studio fund. I think it was last summer, and we've raised maybe $1,700 in a year. So no one can accuse us of being grifters or constantly talking about money. Hey, but we're never going to have a studio at $1,700 a year. So if you like these programs, go to the link on the show page and consider a generous donation. We thank everyone who makes a donation, whether it's $5 or $10. But to get there quicker, we're going to need some bigger donations. And if you want to see truly independent Catholic media, I think you'd find better than All Militaris Radio TV, because we don't have any control over us by any organization, church or state, or anti-globalist. And so a lot of people ignore us because we're not part of their little control network or their little clique. But that's what enables us to make programming that's truly honest, authentic, and sincere, and factual, and historic, without any of the narratives that are used to control you. So please be generous and think of a donation to the Order Militaris Studio Fund, which is held by Order Militaris Inc. Montana, but it's a 501c3 dedicated fund, in the sense that the studio will be owned by a nonprofit. It won't go to the inurement of any individual. And this is not for salaries, and this is not for expenses. Those are already, if AJ has expenses to maintain the website, it's from small donations too. Like if you want to do a $5 or $10 a month subscription to Order Militaris Radio TV. And we thank everyone for their support. So now back to the program, AJ. What were these unusual things that MacArthur did to make Japan one of the great industrial powers of the world today, out of the ruins of a feudalistic monarchist, where they believed their emperor was a god, and a militarist state that was oppressing most of the Orient? And I don't think he fired a shot. One of the great statesmen of the world. So what did you do?
He writes here, never in history had a nation and its people been more completely crushed than were the Japanese at the end of the war. They had suffered more than a military debacle, more than a destruction of their armed forces, more than the elimination of their industrial bases, more even than occupation of their land by foreign bayonets. Their entire faith in Japanese way of life, cherished as invincible for many centuries, perished in the agony of their total defeat. The impact of such disaster was probably greater had ever been experienced in modern history. The extraordinary feudalism which had prevailed in this isolated island had resulted in almost mythological and fanatical belief and invincibility of its arms and superiority of its culture. Although lacking iron, coal, metals, cotton, oil, and nearly all commodity essentials, Japan had prospered in the past century largely because of the thrift industry of its people. By trade and barter, it imported raw materials, the wood of Australia, the cotton of America, the rubber and tin and oil of Malaya and the East Indies, and with its cheap labor and transportation supplied the markets of millions of the coolie class throughout Asia who could not afford the more costly manufactured goods of Europe and America. Its basic policy and purpose was, over the years, had been to secure the bases which supplied its manufacturing plants. It had absorbed Formosa, Korea, and Manchuria. It was attempting to bring China under its control. It had prospered and poured billions of its profits into the outlying areas. Indeed, one of the contributing causes of the war had been its fear of the economic sanctions of the Allies initiated by President Roosevelt. Rightly or wrongly, it felt that this course would paralyze its industry and lead to internal revolution. It had hoped to seize and hold the bases contributing to its industrial empire and thus ensure for all time its sole Greater Asia co-prosperity spirit. And so he's just going through everything that made Japan into what caused them to be so brutal in their military. Like, it was like, now all that power has been gifted to me, and I was like, there's one thing I don't want to do: become a Caesar or a Napoleon.
This is a very humble man to have that opinion, because few men would have that attitude. And let me tell you, as an anthropologist, what MacArthur did in Japan was brilliant, because he's dealing with a population that was pagan. We Christians would call pagan, but you would say it's atheistic. They don't even have a word for God, or they said the heavens or spirits, or animistic. And when someone is completely crushed and all their culture is shown to be defeated, how do you prevent the population from such a deep psychological depression that you have all kinds of mayhem start breaking out all over the place? And Japan was not always a united country. For many hundreds of years, one faction with another over the control of the island, and this could have returned to Japan. But MacArthur, with a brilliant stroke, seized upon the one thing that united the Japanese people, and this is the one thing he didn't touch, that he did respect, and that he used as his tool of government. And tell us more about that, AJ.
So yeah, let's see here. Write down everything. So let's see here. I'll find where we're at. I'm trying to read where you met with the emperor.
Emperor Hirohito.
Yeah. Shortly after my arrival in Tokyo, I was urged by members of my staff to summon the emperor to my headquarters as a show of power. I brushed this suggestion aside. To do so, I explained, would be to outrage the feelings of the Japanese people and to make a martyr of the emperor in their eyes. No, I shall wait. In time, the emperor will voluntarily come to see me. In this case, the patience of the East rather than the haste of the West will best serve our purpose. The emperor did.
Go ahead.
The emperor did indeed shortly request an interview. In a cutaway striped trousers, a top hat, riding in his daimyo, with the imperial grand chamberlain facing him as a jump seat, Hiroshito arrived at the embassy. I had from the start of the occupation directed that there should be no degradation in his treatment. Every honor due a sovereign was to be his. I met him quarterly and recalled that after I had one time been received by his father at the close of the Russo-Japanese War, he was nervous and the stress of the past months showed plainly. I dismissed everyone but his own interpreter, and we sat down before an open fire at the end of the long reception hall. I offered him an American cigarette, which he took with thanks. I noticed how his hand shook as I lighted it for him. I tried to make it as easy for him as I could, but I knew how deep and dreadful must be his agony of humiliation. I had an uneasy feeling that he might plead his own cause against the indictment of as a war criminal. There had been a considerable outcry from some of the Allies, notably the Russians and the British, to include him in this category. Indeed, the initial list of those proposed by them was headed by the emperor's name. Realizing the tragic consequences that would follow such an unjust action, had stoutly resisted such efforts. When Washington seemed to be veering toward the British point of view, I had advised that I would need at least 1,000,000 reinforcements, such action be taken. I believe that if the emperor were indicted and perhaps hanged as a war criminal, military government would have to be instituted throughout all Japan, and guerrilla warfare would probably break out. The emperor's name had been stricken from the list, but all of this he knew nothing. But my fears were groundless. What he said was this: I come to you, General MacArthur, to offer myself to the judgment of the powers you represent, as the one to bear sole responsibility for every political and military decision made and action taken by my people in the conduct of war. A tremendous impression swept me. This courageous assumption of the responsibilities implicit with death, a responsibility clearly belied by facts of which I was fully aware, moved me to the very marrow of my bones. He was an emperor of inherent birth, but in that instant I knew I faced the first gentleman of Japan in his own right. When he left, I started to tell my wife how he looked, but she stopped me with a rippling laugh, saying, "Oh, I saw him, Arthur," and I were peeking behind the red curtains. It's a funny world, but delighted, no matter how you figure it. The emperor called on me often that after that, our conversations ranging over most of the problems of the world. I always explained carefully the underlying reasons for our occupation policy, and I found he had a more thorough grasp of the democratic concept than almost any Japanese with whom I talked. He played a major role in the spiritual regeneration of Japan, and his loyal cooperation influence had much to do with the success of the occupation.
Mhm. Now, I don't know if it was this occasion, but on one occasion in the beginning of the occupation, when he meets the emperor, has a photo taken of himself standing next to the emperor. And here is one of the brilliant things that MacArthur does, because it seems that he's being soft, but he's also firm. So MacArthur was rather a tall man. I think he was over 6 feet high. And Emperor Hirohito was a small man. I think he was close to more like 5 feet. So in this photo, which is very famous, you can find it on MacArthur's Wikipedia page for the occupation or their occupation Japan page. You can see them standing next to one another. So MacArthur orders this photograph to be published in all the Japanese papers. And immediately the Japanese government, because the US didn't abolish the Japanese government, forbade it to be used. But MacArthur countermanded that order because first thing is the Japanese 99.999% of the Japanese had never seen the emperor. They had never seen a photograph of him, except from a certain angle that always made him look taller than everyone around him. So when this photograph was published and they saw how tiny their emperor was, it was considered not an outrage, but it was MacArthur realized that by doing this, he could deflate their superstitious adoration of the emperor and show that he was a mere mortal. And that was necessary for them to break with their entire militaristic past that felt that since their emperor was the god, they could do what they like. And it was a brilliant, as an anthropologist, I say it's absolutely brilliant because it shows that he had a profound understanding of Japanese culture, to know what he could do to respect the emperor so that there'd be peace, and what he had to do to, in a certain sense, disrespect the emperor, to detach the people from their superstitious idolatry of him, which would prevent them becoming a modern democratic government. This worked with the Japanese because of what they thought the emperor is. Actually, the Japanese imperial family is the oldest and noble family in the world. I think it goes back like 3,000 or 4,000 years. And they believe that he's a descendant from the sun, okay? So it's almost like Egyptian in its kind of mentality. But because they thought he's superior to men, the photo had an effect. This wouldn't work with other religions. Like if you showed a short pope next to a tall American president, people wouldn't care, because in the Catholic religion, the height of the pope has nothing to do with his dignity. But in Japan, it was a very important moment in their history to see that. And he shields the emperor from all investigation and all trial for war crimes. And it only was in recent decades the Japanese found that out. They thought the fact that their emperor wasn't tried meant the emperor was innocent. It was only after his death that actually came out that they understood how responsible he was. But MacArthur wanted to spare the emperor that, because the emperor was going to help him govern Japan and lead the people out of this, out of their bad, darkened past.
So now he's getting into the Potsdam Proclamation and getting to the different war crime trials going on.
Yes. What is the Potsdam Proclamation? Summarize it.
It directed specifically that certain justice shall be meted out to all war criminals, including those who have visited cruelties upon our prisoners. So it was pretty much the rule book for how the war crimes are supposed to be judged. And
so there was set up an international tribunal for war crimes in the Pacific. This is not Nuremberg, but you could say it's kind of like the Oriental version. And he put a lot more people to death. He was the actual supreme authority. He was the one that actually wrote out the orders of execution. This tribunal put more people to death than I think Nuremberg did, and was more severe. They didn't just give people a couple of years. They got life imprisonment. And what does MacArthur say about that? Does he have some passage you'd like to read?
yeah, so it is not easy for me to pass penal judgment upon a defeated adversary in a major military campaign. I have reviewed the proceedings in vain search for some mitigating circumstances on his behalf. He's talking about the Bataan Death March and all the stuff in the Philippines. I can find none. Rarely has so cruel and wanton a record have been spread to public gaze. Revolting as this may be in itself, it pales before the sinister and far-reaching implications thereby attached to the profession of arms. The soldier, be friend or foe, is charged with the protection of the weak and unarmed. It is the very essence and reason for his being. When he violates this sacred trust, he not only profanes his entire cult, but threatens the very fabric of international society. The traditions of fighting men are long and honorable. They are based upon the noblest of human traits, sacrifice. This officer of proven field merit, entrusted with the high command involving authority adequate to responsibility, has failed this irrevocable standard, has failed his duty to his troops, to his country, to his enemy, to mankind, has failed utterly his soldier faith. The transgressions resulting therefrom, as revealed by the trial, are a blot upon the military profession, a stain upon civilization, and constitute a memory of shame and dishonor that can never be forgotten. Particularly callous and purposeless was the sack of the ancient city of Manila, with its Christian population and the countless historic shrines and monuments of culture and civilization, which was campaign conditions reversed and previously been spared. It is appropriate here to recall that the accused was fully forewarned as to the personal consequences of such atrocities. On October 24th, 4 days following the landings of our forces on Leyte, it was publicly proclaimed that I would hold the Japanese military authorities in the Philippines immediately liable for any harm which may result from failure to accord prisoners of war, civilian internees, or civilian non-combatants the proper treatment and protection to which they are of rights are entitled. No new or retroactive principle of law, either national or international, are involved. The case is founded upon the basic fundamentals and practices immutable and standardized as the most natural and irrefragable of social codes. The proceedings were guided by the primary rationale of all judicial purposes to ascertain the full truth unshackled by any artificialities of narrow method or technical arbitrariness. The results are beyond challenge. I approve of the findings and sentence of the Commission to direct the Commanding General Army Forces in the Western Pacific to execute a judgment upon the defendant, stripped of uniform, decorations, and other appurtenances signifying membership in the military profession.
So about 5,700 were tried, 4,600 were found guilty, 1,000 were executed, and the rest were sent to life imprisonment. Very, very thorough. Shows you the difference between a trial run by politicians and a trial run by military. There was no, put them in Guantanamo for 6 years and let them out again so they can kill people. There was none of that. That was MacArthur had his head on right, and that was his first task in pacifying Japan. And the next thing, he changed the form of government. Mm-hmm. What did he institute in Japan?
So, I remember the picture. Okay, yeah, there we go. So, I took no part in deliberations of the constitutional problem investigating committee, nor did any member of my staff, because of my hand-off attitude. I was not aware of everything that went on in the committee. For 3 months the work went on. It was not until the end of that period that I was informed of a split in the committee. There were two main groups, those who advocated the adoption of an extremely liberal constitution and those who wanted as little change as possible. The committee reflected, however, the wishes of its chairman, Dr. Matsumoto, who had developed was an extreme reactionary who ruled the deliberations with an iron hand. When the first draft of the new constitution was submitted in January 1946, it turned out to be nothing more than a rewording of the old Meiji constitution. The power of the emperor was deleted not a whit. It simply became supreme and inviolable rather than sacred and inviolable. Instead of incorporating a Bill of Rights, the new Constitution took away some of the few rights that already existed. This was done by simply making them subordinate to the statutory law. For example, it gave a man religious freedom except otherwise provided by law. So yeah, it uh, it reworded everything to keep it imperial.
So he nixed that version, I guess.
Yeah. Then he's like, time's not my friend here. Time's not my friend here. He's like, okay, let's do it my way.
And what was his way?
Accordingly, I directed my staff to assist and advise the Japanese in the formation of an acceptable draft. The Prime Minister himself became active and energetic. Amazing, I can say the word without looking at it. In his final preparation, the Emperor was shown the draft and at once approved, saying that upon these principles we will truly rest the welfare of our people and the rebuilding of Japan. It was a remarkable reaction because these principles were the very ones that were to take away the power of the imperial throne and to sign over the state, the biggest part of his personal estate and that of his family. On March 6th, I stated to the anxious people, it was a sense of deep satisfaction that I am today able to announce a decision of the Emperor and the government of Japan to submit to the Japanese people a new and enlightened constitution which has my full approval. Now, he had to get it printed and put out to the people so they could read it. So they can, read it and see what it says, and so they can actually take part and see what
They want it. Did he have them vote on it?
Then the new constitution was not immediately adopted. It might be called the new spirit of the times in Japan. The members of the he had spent all summer exploring the various ramifications. When it was approved by the lower house in August, there had been a great many changes, although the basic principles were intact. The following month, the House of Peers approved it. The Emperor proclaimed the law of the land on November 3rd, and it went into effect in May 1947. As can be seen, more than a year and a half had gone by since work on the new document had started, and during the whole long period it had been scrutinized by the people of Japan. I know of no similar important document that had ever received so much attention and open debate, including our own Constitution.
Yes. Which is not constitutions are normally written by very few people, and so Japan becomes a representational democracy with a parliamentary system where the emperor only had authority to act on what his advisor said in the cabinet, and where the prime minister, I think the prime minister is the effective de facto head of the government.
So now what was it? It was either a comment. Yeah, it was a comment on the radio page about MacArthur's role in the will be the Eastern Operation Paperclip.
Okay. So maybe since we already covered a lot today, why don't we cover that in the next show? We'll talk about the controversies about MacArthur's occupation in Japan and what he did in Korea, and the many accusations brought against him, like allowing the Communist Party, protecting war criminals, things of that sort. And then his run for the presidency. He ran for the presidency in 1948. Many people don't know that.
Yep. So this is what a military.
So thank you, AJ, for having me on this.
Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you for having me on this episode of Order Militaris Radio TV's Life of Douglas A. MacArthur.
Yep. This is Order Militaris Radio TV signing off. There's fault.
day as well.